turn up. Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Happiness Quest. My name is Jess Dutal from the Center for Transformation at Plymouth State University.
And I'm Maria Sanders, a philosophy professor at Plymouth State University and CEO on Philosophy for Life. So today on the Happiness Quest, we're going to be talking about taking risks and how that plays into our levels of happiness. It might actually feel a little strange, to talk about risk-taking in the context of happiness, because our brains are literally hardwired in a sense to avoid risks.
Yeah.
Our brain goes on high alert when there are risky situations around. And quite honestly, with good cause. I mean, a lot of these risky behaviors can actually harm us. It can lead to dangerous situations, cause harm to ourselves, cause harm to others. But there is such a thing as positive risk or healthy risks. So I guess that's probably a good place for us to start. How would you draw the distinction between just reckless behavior and what we could call a positive or a healthy risk?
So this is interesting, and knowing that we are going to talk about this today, I've reflected on some of the larger risks that I've taken in my life, and certainly there is a distinction between thinking through something that feels meaningful and purposeful and getting outside of our comfort zone because it's new to us versus doing something that we know is unhealthy or ruminating on something which ends up being unhealthy because it doesn't necessarily feel aligned with where we're meant to be, right? But if I think about some of these big risks that I've taken in my life, like, choosing the college I'm going to attend as a young person.
And there are a lot of seniors in high school right now doing just
making that decision right now. Choosing then my first job or the jobs that came after that. Choosing my life's partner. Choosing if I'm going to become a parent. Purchasing a home. All of these things. I look back and interestingly enough, I feel like when I was making those decisions, I leaned very heavily on my intuition and followed my heart. But once sometimes I made that decision, then I panicked and looked back and thought, wow, should I have been more informed, right? Like when I chose to become a parent, I thought, this is a brilliant idea, right? We've been married for a year. Obviously the next thing is, let's have a baby. That sounds really fun. I get to eat as much ice cream as I want. Well, I found out, I found out that wasn't actually the best way to grow a baby, but it sounded fun until I started reading all the parenting books and I thought, oh, maybe this is going to be a little bit more challenging than I thought. But it felt very much in line with where I wanted to be and the goals, values, dreams that I held for myself. And absolutely, it was a big risk becoming a parent.
Well, and it's interesting with all of those examples that you just shared, each one of those could actually be a positive risk, could actually be a reckless choice.
Yes.
So when we think about taking risks, really the trick to it is to go into it with some reflection, some thought, some planning, but not overthinking it.
Right.
Like when you said you relied on your heart, your intuition. If we start to overthink the risk, we more than likely will never take the risk.
Right.
Because we start running again all the what ifs and what can go wrong. And as we've discussed on this show in previous episodes, most of those what ifs never come to fruition. But they can paralyze us.
Yes.
And then we just simply don't make the decision. You bring up becoming a parent. I think that's a huge risk for everybody, that becomes a parent. None of us really enter it fully informed. There are no experts on parenting. I remember as you know, have 4 children. When my first child was born, I'm at the hospital. The doctor comes in to do the final checkup before they release you from the medical care. And I'll never forget that feeling as a new mother. They lay this baby in your arms and say you're free to go.
Yeah. Really?
And honestly, I'm
what am I supposed to do with this
That's
child?
it? Yeah. It's like, I can just take the baby. And I remember the doctor looking at me and going, it's your baby. And it's like, well, yes, but I also bought a calculator last week and it came with an instruction manual that was like the size of a book. Yeah. Nothing here, not even a single
user guide, nothing.
So sure, it's a risk, and there's a lot of fear involved in really all of these major life decisions. And we can plan for some of that. And in fact, it's very healthy to do so.
Right.
But it is important not to paralyze ourselves by overthinking it. I think any parent, if they were fully informed before they went into, I'm not sure they'd ever have kids.
Right.
There's
I agree.
so much to deal with, and
Yes.
it's exhausting.
Well, I felt that way about the purchase of our relatively new home, right? Had I known at the beginning of the process how emotional, financial, this whole process was going to turn out to be, I might have thought, our home that we have right now is just good enough.
Buying a house is one of the greatest stress inducers
Yes.
for most people.
Right.
You know, so
But I'm glad we took that risk because we're so
That's
much
it.
happier in our new space.
well, and going back to having a child, if I'm trying to decide going into becoming a parent whether I can take on all these risks, and again, if I had all that full information, it's terrifying. But after becoming a parent, and now for me personally, I've done the parenting thing for 19 years, I look back on it and I would so do it again. You know, it's so
me too.
worthwhile, it's so rewarding. And that's the value of healthy risk taking. That after you're in the new house, after you've switched the job that maybe you were fearful to leave your present employment and take that chance on that new career, or even it may be within the same type of job but new place of employment. Moving states, moving countries that you live in. I mean, these are all huge risks. Most of that fear is going to be on the front end. And then when you look back, all those fears really become learning experiences and develop who we are.
But it's about how do you then move through the fear, right?
And when should the fear stop you?
When is the red flag enough?
Right, and that's where I come back to
Yeah.
what's the difference between reckless behavior? You know, I'm sitting here thinking, should I have a child, and I'm really scared. Perhaps I shouldn't. And the things that are causing that fear are very real things. I have fear because I'm not really sure how I'm going to be able to afford to put food on the table for this child. I'm not really sure how I'm going to ensure that they have a roof over their head. I mean, these are very real things. And so if I just move forward and have that child anyway, those attributes that are leading to the fear aren't going to just dissolve. I need to have a plan in place on how to resolve that.
Well, going back to intuition, like I tell my children, if there is a circumstance that you find yourself in where it just doesn't feel right, even if you can't put your finger on it, it just does not feel right in your gut, that's a red flag. There's usually something wrong with that. But if it's something that, you know, you've always dreamed of doing and it's the fear that's holding you back, it's just perhaps you think that, what if I fail at this? Or what if it doesn't turn out the way I'm
or
hoping?
it's the uncertainty.
It's the
that you're moving
uncertainty,
into
not
something
the
you're not
actual
familiar.
decision itself. Then that's where we get stuck sometimes. And if we can just get out of our comfort zone for long enough to make that decision, maybe that risk turns out to be one of the best things that we've ever done.
And really
Right?
becomes an essential element in forming who you are
Yes.
as you move forward
Learning
as
and
a human
growing.
being. So I guess an example then of reckless behavior, I think of something like drunk driving. You know, I may have had a couple drinks. Now I'm trying to decide, should I go ahead and get behind the wheel and drive home? And I'm rationalizing to myself, oh, it's not that major of a thing. But again, I'm not thinking logically because
Right.
I'm already in this inebriated state. There's really no example of drunk driving that would be a positive risk taking because we're putting ourselves at harm, we're putting others at harm. But then if I look at something that may be a bit more difficult case to assess, how about something like skydiving? Very risky. You're
Sure.
definitely putting yourself at harm.
If your
you're putting
parachute
others,
doesn't open,
right? It's
That's it.
a risky behavior.
of course. Yeah.
It's not so much that you're harming others unless you land on someone, but it's more that risk to yourself.
Yeah.
Again, could be reckless, could be a healthy risk taking. Depends, again, how I go into it. Am I just waking up one day saying, I'm going to jump out of a plane, and with no training and perhaps not even knowledge about, you know, what constitutes it?
Yeah.
A well-operating or properly functioning parachute,
Sure.
that's reckless. If I go through some classes, I have a trainer with me, I go through those steps, there's still risk involved, and it's high risk.
Yeah.
But it feels different than that reckless behavior of just
It's an
jumping out of
informed
the plane.
decision.
Right.
You've thought about it.
And who else is it going to impact?
Yes.
Very relevant.
Absolutely.
Very relevant. Because let's face it, every time I get on a plane and even fly to another state, it's risky behavior, you know, but it's much less risky than if I'm jumping out of the plane with a parachute. Again, much less risky than the person who's jumping out of the plane with no training. And so there's all these layers, degrees to the risk, and we need to consider that.
Yeah.
So as we think about healthy risks and managing this uncertainty, one of the real values that comes from taking risks is it teaches us our limits. You know, by pushing ourselves beyond our comfort level, we learn more about ourselves and about the world. So it really has a lot to do with our own personal growth. Although, as I was looking at a lot of the research in this area, it was kind of interesting. It felt a little bit like the traditional chicken and egg scenario, like which comes first? Is it that the individual who is more apt to take risks, because we are hardwired differently. Some people are just naturally more adventurous and they want to take risks. Others have to push themselves a little harder to get out there and take the risks. So is it the person who already leans towards taking risks is happier or flourishing because they already have a bit of that hardwiring? Or is it the other way around? Because I'm happy and I'm feeling content with who I am, I'm willing to take more risks. It feels a little safer to me to take the risk. So that's the chicken and egg part of this. It's not real clear which is leading to the other. But what we are seeing pretty consistently in the research, there's definitely a correlation. The two seem to tend to appear together. That those that are taking risks, and again, I'm not talking about the really extreme adventurous behaviors, but the individual who's pushing themselves a little bit beyond their comfort level. You know, they're willing to admit, you know, I feel a little uneasy about taking on A or B, but I'm going to do it anyway. We do find that there does seem to be this correlation with a little higher level of self-reported happiness.
So that's interesting. It makes me think about, you know, an individual's mindset and their belief about their capacity, their capability, and how things would then turn out. So if they do feel content in their life, do they have that sense of confidence or maybe that mindset in looking at a risk and thinking, I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but I believe that I will be better for it.
It's like an inner courage.
Yeah, that inner courage.
And I think that is part of the trick is when we're listening to our inner voice, at what times do we, in a way, have this inner talk that's more courageous replace the inner fear talk?
Right.
And because we don't want to completely snuff out those inner fear conversations we're having, some of that is your well-functioning, hardwired psyche saying, you
to
probably ought to stop.
Keep us safe.
You know, it's a little too risky. So that's the challenging part when we talk about risk-taking. It's really knowing yourself. You know, we come back to Socrates again, who always started with know thyself. It really becomes this exercise of figuring out where our point of balance is. Where's that magic balance between routines, and here again, healthy routines, not where I'm just ruminating on things. So this balance between routines and risk-taking, between the familiar and the unfamiliar. You know, what I have a little more certainty with and what I'm a little less certain.
And in terms of that self-awareness, I find myself asking, what would I do? What would I really love to do if I weren't afraid to try it? And testing myself that way. And a quote comes to mind by Eleanor Roosevelt, and she said, do one thing every day that scares you. But I think she meant that in the best way possible in terms of what would you do if the fear wasn't a factor, right?
Well, and that is a philosophy that a lot of really successful entrepreneurs adopt is, how would I act, what would I do if I had no fear? And then from there, take a step back, because again, no fear is not a good thing.
No.
But what it does if we challenge ourselves hypothetically to start there is it does force us to really take stock and reflect upon the fears that we have. and how real are those fears. It comes back to the common theme that we continue to talk about on this particular show, and that is living these intentional, meaningful lives. Life becomes an activity. It's not passive.
Right.
And so I have to make the choices. That requires me to reflect upon, become informed, you know, come up with plans, but it also requires action. And so it's not enough to just think through all of these issues. We have to try them. You know, I'm reminded of a friend of mine who always wanted to travel to England, but she didn't have anyone to travel with. And she was raised in a generation, a little older generation than mine, where she was raised to really believe that women shouldn't be traveling alone. You know, that's scary and bad things can happen. Even though in her mind, she's like, I can't really come up with what's going to go wrong. And so it felt like this irrational fear. And so she was talking to me the one day and asking about, because as you know, I take students to England on a pretty regular basis. And she's like, what's that like, you know, to go to England? I'm like, well, you need to go. You need to go check it out, have that experience. And she's like, oh, I would be too terrified to do so. And so what I advised her is take small steps. Build that self-confidence a little bit at a time. Start by going and having a meal by yourself at a restaurant, which she had never done. And start with a place that you're familiar and comfortable with. Maybe it's just grabbing coffee at a cafe, then moving to actually having lunch,
a meal.
Then moving to dinner, where it's a little less likely there are going to be a lot of people that are alone. And then once you're comfortable doing that, start taking small trips. You know, a day trip, something local on your own. Move it to a weekend.
So you're stretching your comfort zone over time.
You're stretching that and pushing those limits of what you're afraid of. You slowly realize these aren't real fears. And so I was thrilled 2 years ago, she had sent me through email a copy of her plane ticket that she's going to England. And she's going by herself. And there are so many opportunities nowadays to do things. Like, we shouldn't be held back, you know, just because we're waiting on someone else or trying to convince someone else to do the things that really are on our bucket list. And so I think that's an example of how fear can hold us back, but we do have a way to work through that with a little step at a time. And there was, I pulled it, if I find it here, there was a study that was conducted on taking these small steps. Basically, it was small doses of risk-taking. This actually was conducted in London, ironically, where they looked at the small doses of risk-taking behavior was increasing self-efficacy, which is really that idea, I think I can.
Yeah, that
belief in yourself.
And that confidence.
And it was that increase in self-efficacy that they're correlating to an increase in human flourishing, in happiness, how we view our existence overall. And so there does seem to be this direct connection, even if I haven't completely mastered risk-taking, if I'm working on it, if I'm taking steps towards it.
And it changes how we move through the world and how we see ourselves and how we understand our connection to the people around us. So
and changes us.
And changes us.
And how we view
ourselves. And that reflection piece, I think, allows the time to set the intention. That maybe this is a little uncomfortable, maybe it's a bit out of my norm or what feels familiar. But if I set the intention, I believe that I will land where I need to, then it makes it maybe a little bit easier to take that risk because you took the time to become informed, maybe to read about, you know, where it is you're traveling to and the areas, and I'd like to hit up this tourist spot and go to this restaurant. So you feel a little bit more comfortable.
Right, and you put those things in place, and so it doesn't become reckless at that point. It is just truly risk-taking.
But it seems like your friend, she always had this, like you said, it was on her bucket list. It felt aligned with where she wanted to be. And so how beautiful that she had the opportunity to finally do that.
Well, and I commend her. There are a lot of individuals that never would have worked the courage up.
Because they stay stuck in that fear.
Right.
Yeah.
So, no, that was wonderful.
Right.
You had mentioned a little earlier about risk-taking involving this fear of failure.
Yeah.
You know, the fear that somehow either we're going to look foolish or what we're trying to accomplish isn't actually going to come to fruition. I'm reminded of a study that was a couple philosophers at New York University conducted, where they had individuals placed within gambling situations, where half of the group was told, just assume that this gambling is part of your regular day. So every day you're going to place a bet and expect that you're going to lose at least half of whatever the money you start with. The other half of the participants, they didn't prep with those statements. So basically what they were setting up is half of the group already had this expectation of failure. You know, that by the time I'm done, I'm going to lose half of what I'm starting with. Yeah. The other half, they were not presupposing any sort of expectation. And what they found overwhelmingly, the ones that had the expectation that they were going to fail suddenly weren't stressed out. They didn't worry about losing the money because it was already in their mind like, well, okay, I'm going to lose it.
They've already reconciled
that they were going to lose it. They ended up doing better and functioning better. And I have to admit, I mean, I'm not a hardcore gambler. Every once in a while I'll go, and I'm probably almost like a joke of a gambler because I'm the one that goes into Vegas with $20 and I'm done. Yeah. You know, it's like, but I have to admit, I go in with, this is the amount I'm going to spend.
Yes.
And when I say spend it, if I win, that goes in a separate pocket, you know, so this 20 is what I'm going to lose. So when I leave that casino, I either leave with nothing or anything that I leave with, it's what came out of that 20. Right. It's not always above 20, but it's
you're
the
willing
winnings.
to part with the 20.
Exactly.
Yes.
That was my entertainment I bought, just as if I was buying a ticket to a concert, and that's how I view it.
It's a smart way to go into that experience.
Very different than if you're going in saying, I'm going to like make this my career, or I'm going to get wealthy tonight. That's a much different mindset.
Right. Well, I had an experience with gambling on our honeymoon when Brian and I went to the Bahamas. And we went out to dinner to this beautiful little restaurant, and before we got there, we stopped at a casino. It was my very first time in a casino, so it was very special to me. And we, you know, exchanged $1 for 4 quarters. We played the slot machine once. We won a quarter. And I thought, that's it. We beat the system. We're out of here. so I won a quarter. Yes, you know it. So I won a quarter, and I thought, I have to go. Because I went in thinking we could lose all the money that we brought here, and then we don't get to go to the beautiful little restaurant. We don't get to do any fun things on this trip. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to that, I'm not a risk taker.
Well, and that comes back to the, I think, know thyself.
Yes.
Because I have to agree with you. There's some entertainment. I get a little bit out of that gambling, but not much.
No, I watch
people who really light up over the gambling. I just never did. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a certain kind of hardwiring that, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm not a risk taker, but not in that way.
Yeah.
And maybe it's different because the other thing we haven't talked about yet is how many other people are depending upon you. Right. I have to admit, it could be different if I was single, I didn't have children, I didn't have to worry about a mortgage, I didn't have to worry about, maybe then it feels different. But those responsibilities, it feels reckless, at least in my position in life right now. And again, I think it's important to mention that can change over time. You know, what may be a healthy risk-taking in our 20s could be reckless in our 40s or 50s, or vice versa. You know, so it really does come down to living intentionally throughout our entire life and making these assessments. Although, as we age, we tend to take less risks. And so this advice of pushing our comfort level a bit becomes even more important as we get older.
Because we get stuck in the routines, or why? Why do we?
I think there are a couple of factors they're seeing in the research.
Our frontal lobe is fully developed, so that's part of it.
But again, that would be more of a distinction between reckless behavior and risk-taking. Part of what the research is showing is how strong we feel internally has a direct impact on how many risks we'll take. So as we age, we do tend to physically become weaker. Yeah. You know, even if we're working at it. Now we do find those that have healthy routines and exercise routines and so forth do tend to take more risks than those that are in the same age bracket and they're not feeling healthy.
Sure.
But
you're not going to plan to hike Everest.
Exactly. That very healthy 50 or 60-year-old is still going to have a hard time competing with the 20-year-old in that same physical. So that's part of it. Is they're saying some of it is our minds, again, that hardwiring trying to protect us, saying, you're not your 20-year-old self anymore. But the danger is sometimes that makes us pull back far too much. And now we say, well, I can't do anything, or I can do very little, when in fact, most of that is just fear. And we can actually still be very active, which we've seen even generationally a huge shift with the baby boomers. Much more active generation at this age than many of the previous generations when they hit that age bracket.
My parents are baby boomers, and my dad chaperones the winter program at Plymouth Elementary School with my children, still skiing. So,
and I have to admit, my parents are baby boomers, and when I compare their activities to my grandparents at the same age, there's no comparison. So much more active, and part of that is just believing that they can be more active, believing
and having
in
that courage, right? And it's also that willingness to be vulnerable, to step outside.
That's huge.
Right? Of that comfort zone we're talking about, and just having the willingness to try something new.
Yeah, no, that's extremely valuable. Yeah. So as we think about how to become a positive risk taker, there's really, as I would see it, about maybe 3 or 4 things we should keep in mind. And most of these we've talked about. One is increasing our risk for our tolerance for taking risks. So if we're not already naturally an adventurous person, try something new. I know for myself, I tend to always try to take some sort of what I would consider to be considerable risk, something that's really outside of my comfort zone, at least once a year.
Yeah.
It's like go somewhere that maybe I'm a little hesitant to travel there. There's too much unknown or uncertainty, or trying a new activity, something completely different. When I moved to New Hampshire, it was a very different geographic location than the area in Texas that I had moved from. And so I remember the first time I kayaked. It was a big risk on my part. It's like, okay, this thing could tip over. There was risks involved. Now it's just comical when people watch me get in and out of a kayak. But I love kayaking and never would have discovered that. And we know in the happiness research that that is one element that keeps surfacing, is when people are willing to try new things, they tend to report higher levels of happiness, because we can't find the things that bring us happiness if we're not trying.
If we don't discover
new
them.
Things.
So I have a friend, every year on her birthday, she tries something new that she's never experienced before.
That's
and
wonderful.
I think that's amazing.
Wonderful. Yeah, I tend to take stock on New Year's. Usually New Year's Day or the day after New Year's Day is when I'll look and go, okay, have I done anything within a year, or what am I doing next? That's kind of outside of that comfort zone, to keep growing. Second thing, expect and prepare to fail.
Of course.
Now that sounds strange. We don't want to fail, but it's really shifting our perspective of how we look at failings.
And making mistakes and growing and learning.
They're really just opportunities for that growth, and we honestly can't grow if we never fail, because that's where the lessons come. So once we shift our mindset to expect that failure, it's a pleasant surprise when it doesn't happen, but when it does, it's not earth-shattering. It doesn't derail us.
It doesn't then prevent you from taking another chance in the future.
And it says to expect and prepare to fail. In other words, have a plan. Think about what is your worst-case scenario.
What if this doesn't work out?
And have a plan for dealing with that. I loved this one. Channel your inner superhero. And basically it comes down to tapping into that inner courageous self, because all too often we let the fear, that noise, get very loud to where it ends up taking over.
That inner dialogue that isn't always gentle or kind, right?
Exactly.
So also transforming how you speak to yourself
extremely important.
Is a big deal.
Extremely important. And then becoming more aware of what risk-taking activities are even out there. Learning about risk-taking, like a show like this where we're talking about it. What the research has shown is by merely becoming aware of risk-taking, people tend to take more risks, which makes sense. It's on our radar. at that point. And then finally, learn the routine, that balance that works best for you.
Yeah.
So again, it comes back to that balance between the mundane, the common, the routines in my life, and these adventurous, risk-taking activities in my life. So finding that balance that works
balance
for ourselves.
And setting your intention for yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. So it looks like we're out of time already, but it keeps coming back to the same lesson about balance. That as we're thinking about taking risks and avoiding purely reckless behaviors, but taking those healthy risks, it does seem to come right back to finding out what is our own point of balance, knowing ourselves, and trusting ourselves. So I encourage you to go out, try something new. Thanks for joining us.
Great.